Welcome to your quick video about ecosystems and biodiversity. By the end of this video, I would like you to be able to say that you can define biodiversity and explain its importance to an ecosystem. Let's start with what is an ecosystem. We have a few definitions. This first definition is what we got from our NatureWorks website. It is a community of living organisms along with the non-living components of the environment. Jafar in the Bill Nye video gave us a slightly different definition that some of us liked better and that I've changed a little bit. So this is an ecosystem is made up of living things and non-living things that live together in an environment. I think Jafar just said plants and animals and an environment, and some of you guys said you didn't really like that because it didn't include the non-living things in an environment. Now this is all right, except there's a lot of confusion about what is considered living, what isn't living. Do we consider dead trees living or are they non-living? So I'm going to change it just a little bit and add two new words to our vocabulary. So what we're going to call an ecosystem is a community of biotic and abiotic factors that exist together in an environment. We'll talk a little bit more about what biotic and abiotic factors are in just a moment. I do want to mention that ecosystems can be any size. They're usually specific and defined spaces and locations. So we could talk about the ecosystem in our courtyard, or the pond ecosystem in the Skokie Lagoons, or even the forest ecosystem in the Skokie Lagoons. Some scientists just think of the entire Earth as its own ecosystem. So instead of saying living and non-living, I introduced two new words to you, biotic versus abiotic. So biotic factors, or biotic things, are things that are living, or were living, or come from something that was living. So animals, plants, bacteria, fungi, but also dead trees, dead animal matter, dead leaves on the forest floor. Anything that is alive or came from something that is alive is a biotic factor. Abiotic factors are chemical and physical things that aren't alive and never were alive. So these are things like sunlight and water and rocks. Everybody loves to mention rocks as their favorite non-living thing. Sand, or the amount of oxygen. So if we take a look at this lovely coral reef ecosystem, there are several biotic and abiotic factors. Let's list the biotic factors first. So in this example, some of the biotic factors are fish, and the coral itself is alive. Coral is an animal. There are shrimp in there. There's some bacteria all over the place. Bacteria in the coral, bacteria on the fish, bacteria in the guts of the fish. There are also probably dead fish laying around. There's some dead coral. As the coral dies, it still exists. It's important, but it's no longer alive, but it's still a biotic factor. If we wanted to list some of the abiotic factors, in this case, we could talk about the sunlight, the water, the salt dissolved in the water, since this is ocean water, very salty, the temperature. This looks like it's in a pretty warm place, and so probably some of these organisms could only exist in a warm temperature. The oxygen dissolved in the water so that the fish and other organisms can breathe. And then there's probably some sand on the ocean floor that we just can't see in this picture. So those are the abiotic factors. They're not alive, and they never have been alive. Now that we know about what an ecosystem is, we're going to talk about biodiversity. The very simple definition of biodiversity is how much variation we have in life, or how much variation exists in life. There are two kinds of biodiversity that we can think about. There's species biodiversity, which is also called species richness. This is how many different species you have in a particular ecosystem. There's also ecosystem biodiversity, which is how many different ecosystems you have in a particular area. When we do our BioBlitz, we are going to be really focusing on species biodiversity. How many different species are we finding in a particular ecosystem? So what's the big deal? Why is biodiversity so important when we're studying ecology and ecosystems? Well, remember that quote from the video, "You can't pick a flower without jiggling a star." everything you do in an ecosystem affects something else. Sometimes it affects a lot of things, sometimes it has huge, huge impact, sometimes just slight impact, but everything is connected. Plants, animals, living things, non-living things in ecosystems are all connected. An ecosystem that has a lot of species biodiversity, species richness, or an area that has a lot of ecosystem biodiversity is much better equipped, or has a much better time surviving any kind of disturbance. So this could be a forest fire, it could be a city being built up, urbanization, a drought, or some kind of disease that moves into the area. Any ecosystem that has a lot of biodiversity has a much better chance of surviving any kind of disturbance. If we want to talk about a specific example, these are pictures of trees that have been infected with Port Orford cedar root disease. So this attacks the roots of the trees and the trees die. If the Port Orford cedar was the only tree that existed in this ecosystem, all of the pine trees would die. That meant that all of the things that inhabit the pine trees or get protection from the pine trees or use the pine trees as a source of food would no longer have shelter or food. And if those organisms were no longer able to survive, then the organisms that depended on those organisms would no longer be able to survive, and so on and so on. If this disease moved into an area that had a lot of different pine trees, then only some of the pine trees would die, and the ecosystem would still be able to survive with its remaining pine trees. So that's it. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you later.